Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, Episode 17. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder for our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian. Bethany Allen is a China reporter at Axios, where she writes high-impact investigations, exclusives, and analyses about China, with a focus on how China projects power and influence beyond its own borders. Bethany is also the author of Beijing Rules, How China Weaponized Its Economy to Confront the World. Before joining Axios, Bethany served as lead reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, China Cables Project, a major leak of classified Chinese government documents revealing the inner workings of mass internment camps in Xinjiang. For her work on the China Cables Project, she received the Robert D.G. Lewis Watchdog Award, top prize awarded annually by the Society of Professional Journalists DC Dateline Awards, as well as the Investigative Journalism Prize in the online category. The China Cables Project was also a finalist for the Batten Medal for Courage in Journalism. Bethany previously lived in China for 4 years. She now lives in Taiwan. Bethany, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. So, as mentioned in the pre-show, we like for our audience to get to know who the people are that we've invited to the desk to have a conversation. I'm guessing that you didn't just enter first grade in elementary school and say, one day I'm going to live in China and live in Taiwan and write about China weaponizing its economy. Maybe I'm wrong, but how about you share a little bit about what were the circumstances of life that brought you into being a writer and focusing in this area?
Sure. I mean, you're right. When I was in first grade, I definitely did not imagine myself taking this career path. I'm from a town in West Texas, and that's also where I went to college. But when I was in college, I studied abroad in China, in Xiamen, which is in the south in Fujian province. And it's actually just quite random that I chose China. I just wanted to go somewhere I had never been before. And at that time in my life, I had never even had American-style Chinese food. I didn't know anything about China. I was pretty much a blank slate. And when I showed up there, within a few weeks, I really just completely fell in love with the language, the culture, the Chinese friends that I made, the history. And I've dedicated my life to China and to studying China ever since. And after I graduated from university, I went back to China and enrolled directly at Peking University in their Chinese program to learn Chinese full time. And I lived in China for 4 years, 2 of those years in school, 2 years working. And I got into journalism later when I really wanted to use my Chinese, and I really wanted to write about China in a way that people would read. And initially I considered academia. I wanted to get a PhD in early modern Chinese history. And then I entered a master's program at Yale University with the intention of getting a PhD. And pretty quickly I realized that while I love history, I also want to have a job. So I, shifted gears and went into journalism, which has been a great fit for me because not only do I get to deal with China and with Chinese language and Chinese people, I also get to deal with ideas and to, dream up big new ideas. And on top of that, I also get to be, an investigator. I'm an investigative journalist, and I love the chase. I love getting tips and leads and digging for things and, finding new knowledge. And there's a saying that I really adhere to. It says that, journalism is uncovering things, is publishing things that powerful people don't want you to publish. Everything else is PR. And that is really how I feel. So that is more or less how I ended up where I am today. I moved to Taiwan after I was banned from China in 2019, presumably for my journalism. And at the time, it was rather lonely, but now I'm in good company because pretty much all the American reporters have been banned, although some are getting back in.
Well, welcome to the club of being banned from going to the People's Republic of China. Sadly, the territories you can no longer go to also now includes Hong Kong, which used to be a wonderful place to come and go to. And it's good to know that you are being well received in Taiwan. I spent a lot of my life living in and coming and going to Taiwan. And they do a pretty decent job of welcoming and making friends with visiting journalists or academics, and even occasional washed up foreign officials can come through and be very, very well received in what I call Fantasy Island, where all your dreams come true. It's a great place to live, but it's also a great perch from which to watch China. But before we jump into a little bit more of the substance, you answered one of the questions that I was going to have right off the bat. Was you had this time of living and working in China, like a lot of people. I think a lot of Americans, but maybe people from other parts of the world too. We grow up with somewhat romanticized notions of Chinese history and culture, and when we go there and have first contact, a lot of those are reinforced. The people can be quite kind, and you can have some really positive experiences, but usually somewhere along the way, you get mugged by reality. And it's not always the people, it's usually the government that's doing the mugging. And what you described as the mission of investigative journalism sure sounds antithetical to what the comms department, in air quotes, of the Communist Party would like to permit. So talk a little bit about, was it a slow cooking frog, or was it kind of a sudden break where you were doing your work reasonably well as a foreign correspondent, investigative journalist can do in China, and then the door closes? Or was it a few bumps along the way and realized this was going to come to a head? Certainly what you were doing with China cables was going to be poorly received. Share a little bit about that break with being able to come and go and enjoy your life in China.
Yeah. Well, the China cables came after. So I started, I worked on that project after I'd already been banned. So interestingly, and it was, I think, a bit of a canary in the coal mine. I was, blacklisted, or whatever you want to call it, denied a visa in China, a journalist visa, when I was still based in DC. So I lived in China from 2008 to 2012, and then I came back to the US, and I was living in Washington, DC from 2014 to 2022. And so I was covering China for that time. I was focused on China the entire time, covering China from Washington, D.C. And but I was still able to go back to China. I went on a reporting trip there in 2015. I went on another reporting trip in 2016. And then in 2017 and 2018, I began an investigative series on China's covert political interference in the United States. And I was the first U.S. journalist to write about that. I was the first person to write about that happening in the United States. And it was, that series was very influential in governments around the world, in democratic governments. And I know this because government officials from governments around the world began seeking me out, as early as, early 2018. Including the U.S. government, asking me more about my work. And my work began to influence policy in the U.S. and in other democratic countries. Now, the Chinese government, being the Chinese government, there's no transparency. So in 2018, actually, late 2018, I was hired by Agence France Presse, AFP, the French newswire, to be their Beijing correspondent. And I didn't expect the visa process to go easily or quickly. But after waiting for 6 months, I was able to learn that I would not be receiving a visa. And this was the first time in AFP's history that one of their correspondents had not been granted a visa. Mm-hmm. And that was it. I was never given a reason. And in fact, what happened was my visa application wasn't denied. It was just never processed, which is standard.
Very common.
That's how they do it. So that, at the time, I was totally crushed. I had dedicated my life to this country, not because I hated it, which is what the Chinese government wants people to believe, about journalists, but because I loved it. You don't dedicate to life to things that you hate. And I had crafted so much of my life around it. And living in China in my 20s had been an incredibly formative experience. And I was concerned that my journalism career was over, because in 2019, this was before news outlets really started hiring or having positions for China reporters outside of China. I had just managed to do it from DC because I'm incredibly stubborn.
Yeah.
And it was right around that time that the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists was looking for someone quietly. They didn't announce it, but they were looking for someone with, China investigative experience to lead a project. But they wanted someone who wasn't afraid of not being able to go back to China. And so I really fit the bill. I had previously reported from Xinjiang. I had covered Muslims in China for a long time. And so they brought me on to lead that project.
Very interesting journey and sort of transition that brings us into kind of the two big projects that I'd like to dive into for the balance of our conversation. I think for most of my career in dealing with U.S.-China relations, some people, some of the time, would know what Xinjiang is, but probably not. And some people, some of the time, would know what a Uyghur is, but mostly wouldn't. And it really hasn't been until recent years that mainstream news outlets and programs in radio, television, and print began to actually speak more about this situation. I'll say as the outset, it is a genocide, but his situation, I guess, is how it would begin to get covered. And really, I think I'm kind of amazed that now it actually gets a fair amount of conversation in Congress, in television, radio, and print, but it definitely wasn't always the case. And so when we talk about the China Cables Project, first, we will give us a little bit of a primer about what the sort of scope of work was for this China Cables Project. And then we'll continue the conversation about what some of your key findings and key takeaways were, and what that meant for China, for the United States, the world. And we definitely want to talk a little bit about what the Communist Party of China and its influence operations were to try to shape perceptions about this. But start at the beginning. How did this China Cables Project come into being, and what were you sort of launched to go after?
Yeah, so at the very beginning, how it all started was I was handed a stack of Chinese language documents, and and that was it. What is this? What does it mean? And it was, so I just sat with those documents for several weeks in the beginning, reading through them, analyzing every character, trying to figure out what it was that I was looking at. And what it was that I was looking at was there were three different kinds of documents, but two of them were the bulk of it. And one of those was essentially, in layman's terms, an operating manual for the mass internment camps in Xinjiang. And these were marked, classified. China has a 3-tier classification system. It was tier 2. And they were internal documents that, of course, that had been circulated within the party and security mechanisms in Xinjiang. And that document, what we're calling the operating manual, was 24 pages long. And there were certain parts of it that were extremely alarming. And one part, for example, was where it talked about how to prevent escapes. Now, it's really important to know that up to this point, now there had been reporting on what people thought the camps might be, but it was all, externally. It was all people, it was survivors. It was looking at satellite imagery. It was looking at tenders that had been posted, to try to build them, et cetera. This was the first time that we were getting a glimpse from the inside, from the Chinese Communist Party itself, how it was talking to itself about the camps. But externally, the phrases and the terms that the party had been using to sell the camps to the outside world was that they were vocational education and training centers, purely voluntary, a wonderful service and part of the Chinese government's poverty alleviation program in Xinjiang. But these documents said one of the main goal responsibilities of people running the camps was to prevent escapes. And there were very in-depth details about how to prevent escapes, what kinds of vehicles can come in, what can come out. And there was a line about how every corner of the camp, including bathrooms, should be blanketed in surveillance cameras. And there was another very chilling line about preventing abnormal deaths. I mean, what university in its internal guidelines has a line about making sure that you prevent abnormal deaths? So clearly these were not voluntary. Clearly the conditions were such that people might die, and in fact probably had been dying when they weren't supposed to die, which of course begs the question, were there times when people were supposed to die? So that was one aspect of it. Another set of documents were were reports from something that we now know as IJOP, the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, which is a mass data gathering program in Xinjiang, which you could, these internal documents cast as predictive policing, mass data-based predictive policing, as though you can get enough data from enough sources to try to understand when a crime will happen. In this case, what they are calling terrorism and separatism, which of course is not what's actually happening. And there were 4 reports. And all of these documents were dated June 2017, June 2017. So there were 4 reports from IJOP from June 2017. And one of them was a report saying, and this line from it is burned into my brain forever. And it went like this: from June, one day in June to another day in June, so a 1-week span. I can't remember the exact dates, but it's June 16th to June 23rd, 2017. There were 2,300 names that were put forward by IJOP, and the word they use is push, like a push notification. There were 2,300 names that were pushed by this mass data gathering platform. So these names were sent out across all the different counties in Xinjiang to all the different security departments. And of those 2,300 names, approximately 1,600 people were located and assessed, and most of them put into vocational training. What is that? In the span of 1 week, 1,600 people's lives had been ruined, and they had been put into concentration camps. And then it was just put there in such a cold, calculated, sterile way. And the rest of that document spent all of it had 6 points of analysis analyzing why they weren't able to locate all 2,300 of them. Why weren't they able to round up more people and put them into camps? And so that was the work that we were doing. And there's many other points, but the China cables were incredibly important to building a case for crimes against humanity and genocide, because they put forward irrefutable proof that the party knew what it was doing, that it was talking to itself about what it was doing, and it was proof for the rest of the world to what it was actually doing in Xinjiang. And those documents in our work has been cited in government reports and UN reports, in legal cases making the argument for genocide, and has been widely read in democratic governments around the world. Yeah.
It's truly tremendous contribution. In my experience, immediately after 9/11, there were just countless efforts by Chinese authorities, China experts, and others to try to talk about cooperation between the United States and China on counterterrorism, because 9/11 had changed everything. And there were all these urgent passages about the threats that China was facing from Xinjiang. And from my earlier experience, I knew that that was meant to influence rather than to inform. But we lacked what you were able to reveal, which was incontrovertible evidence from them that what we thought and borderline knew was going on really was going on. Because prior to this, it really was just the aerial photos. In 1998, I had tried to go to Xinjiang, and it was before I was banned. But they only found it convenient to take me as far as Qinghai province.
Mm.
But from there, somehow it was just not convenient to arrange for a connecting flight to go to Ulaanbaatar or anywhere else. Just not convenient. But nevertheless, you can see all you want to see here. So a lot of us that would have been looking and trying to provide some evidence to Congress, to the executive branch, or the media, were just blocked from being able to get it. So this was an incredibly important reveal. And I think it also had the added virtue of, since these were documents, it doesn't really matter what the politics or ideology are of the person who found them. A lot of times, the China's information machine is very good at trying to discredit the people who bring things out. And so they'd say this person is a China hater or a splittist, or they're overly religious, all kinds of terrible things. But to have the actual documents really was a tremendously important threshold. Obviously, it did affect policy. It took a long time, probably longer than you expected, for it to kind of get the wheels turning in our government. But now we have leaders of both parties that have called this a genocide. We have frequent references to this situation in Congress. The new select committee, Republicans and Democrats, talking very directly about this. But I guess the one area of policy that I'd like to get your take on is, having vested this as a part of your career and your life, now we have the law that's supposed to block the ability to do business with entities that have ties to this region, where you can't prove that forced labor is not being used. And of course, from your life experience, that's pretty hard to prove. But what has been your observation about implementation of that act, and what have been your observations about how the China spin machine has been trying to deal with that too?
Yeah, I mean, the Xinjiang Forced Labor Prevention Act, its passage is such a miracle. It's something that 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we could never even have imagined. And I would also say that when the Trump administration sanctioned the XPCC, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which was in 2020, that's also something that even just a year before or 2 years before would have been unthinkable. And so it's really been astonishing to see how finally the US government has gotten behind this issue and understood the import of what's happening in Xinjiang and the future of the Uyghurs and other ethnic minority Muslim groups there. I remember the first time that a top-ranking US official ever said the word, Uyghur, talked about the persecution of the Uyghurs there. I remember very clearly. It was October 2018. It was when Mike Pence was giving the Trump administration's big China speech at Hudson Institute, and he called it out. And that was the beginning. That was the beginning of the Trump administration taking on this issue. And it was an interesting interplay in the Trump administration. We're all familiar with the different factions of China policy within the Trump administration. And Trump himself certainly did not care about Uyghurs. But he after the coronavirus pandemic, so in 2020, he took his foot off the brake on the people in the Trump administration, in his administration, who wanted to really pursue the Xinjiang issue and really help Uyghurs. And so after the pandemic, we saw an accelerated push from the National Security Council and also across the administration on pushing back against the genocide there, getting it labeled a genocide. The XPCC sanction, and then in Congress, the incredible work and the dedication that advocates and Uyghur activists had in going out and pleading their case with lawmakers, in the way that lawmakers really supported that and pushed for that and passed it, which is extraordinary. So to your question of its implementation, it has from the beginning been a gargantuan task, and one that cannot be and will never be implemented perfectly. But I think that the pursuit of perfection in this case, it would be an obstacle to improvement, right? And one of the big obstacles is that there's several. In the beginning, it was lack of manpower. To implement such an enormous requirement on companies, it takes more resources than the government initially put for it. And then they were able to get Congress gave a $28 million allocation to help with the implementation of the act, which was good. But another issue now that we're seeing is that on the Chinese government side, they're watching this unfold just like anybody else. And so they've been clamping down on supply chain data, it's always been difficult to trace supply chains, but it's gotten even harder to trace supply chains to Xinjiang. And something that's incredibly concerning that we're also seeing is the criminalization within China of the private firms that do the due diligence checks, the audits of supply chains. And so you have kind of a catch-22 here, where exporters or importers in the US cannot get the audits that they need to show that their products don't have forced labor. However, it's even getting harder to show that products even trace back to Xinjiang at all. So that's kind of where things stand.
Yeah, well, in this era of people talking about corporate social responsibility, it's very difficult for me to put together in my mind how anyone gets a positive score for doing business in a country where it used to be we knew they were fudging their economic statistics because they wanted to over promote growth, or they were trying to move forward some economic or personal interest. But there's definitely a weaponization of the legal and security systems now that basically makes it not only illegal, but physically dangerous for someone to actually engage in normal accounting and transparency and other kinds of work. And when it touches on something like this, I don't see how that social responsibility score is pretty much above zero when you're dealing with situations like this. Is that consistent with what you've observed?
Well, I'm not a big believer in corporate social responsibility. I don't think it's reasonable or possible. I think it's the government's job to regulate companies, to pass laws, to shape their behavior and change their behavior, not the responsibility of companies to do anything other than follow the laws. And I think that what we've seen in the US in the past, well, really 40 years, but let's say 20 years, is an abnegation on the part of the US government to sufficiently regulate companies and to force them to behave in a more moral and politically moral way. And that's exactly what the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is it's making up for that failure of the US government to put democratic and human rights guardrails on economic behavior. And that's exactly what my book is about, is how these two things need to be relinked.
Well, you've given the pivot for where we wanted to go in the next basket of our conversation topics, to go ahead from the cables project into your book project about China weaponizing its economy. And so We want people to dive into that subject matter for sure, but talk a little bit about kind of the basic contours of the concept that the title and the core message of the book is.
Yeah. So the title, Beijing Rules, How China Weaponized Its Economy to Confront the World. The question that I had going into this book was, what is the primary power that China is exercising and is going to be exercising in the 21st century? And I have spent, most of my career as a journalist looking at how China projects power beyond its borders. And I was never satisfied with the way that we talked about it, the words that we were using to describe it, and certainly not satisfied with the policies that people were recommending to try to push back against it. And that's what led me to write this book. And so my basic, argument and observation is that the Chinese government has actually been incredibly innovative in coming up with ways of gatekeeping its economy to either punish or reward the behavior of governments, companies, and individuals around the world in such a way that their activity, their speech, and their decisions are shaped to be in line with the Chinese Communist Party's core interests. And that's a kind of power, a kind of economic lever that the US and the West has been very ill-suited to observe and to counter. And so, what I call that, the term that I use to describe this, is authoritarian economic statecraft, not just economic coercion, because coercion is a stick, but China also uses carrots. And economic statecraft, of course, by definition, is the use of economic power for geopolitical purposes. So we're not talking about how China is using its economy to make its economy bigger. We're not talking about pure trade issues. We're talking about using economy for political purposes. And I call it authoritarian because the way that China does this is illiberal. Economic statecraft is nothing new. The US engages in economic statecraft. Every major country engages in economic statecraft. But there are some key differences with the way that the Chinese government does it and the way that the US and the West and the EU typically do it. And I'll make that a little bit clearer. The most standard traditional form of economic statecraft with which we are all familiar is sanctions, and certainly the U.S. uses sanctions and is increasingly using sanctions. My numbers here are not going to be exact, but in approximately the year 2000, the U.S. had levied 900 sanctions. Now, or as of 2022, that number was around 9,000. So there's been a massive rise in U.S. sanctions, and there's also multilateral sanctions, issued through, with our allies and partners. And overwhelmingly, not 100%, but overwhelmingly, those sanctions are levied in order to uphold multilateral principles that many people agree will create a better world, including nuclear nonproliferation, countering terrorist financing, preserving the integrity of the international financial system through, for example, fighting money laundering, and upholding and punishing violators of human rights, such as dictators. And there have been exceptions, and this really proves the rule. And one exception would be during the Trump administration, the U.S. sanctioned 2 international criminal court investigators for doing their jobs, for investigating possible U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. And that was an illiberal use of sanctions because it was pursuing the U.S.'s pure national interest, countering multilateral institutions and countering the democratic and human rights-based system that we have helped set up. But that is rare. And the Biden administration lifted those sanctions after President Biden was elected. China's economic statecraft, on the other hand, is purely 100% of the time to uphold its own narrow geopolitical interests, such as the sovereignty of Taiwan, fighting the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, of course, the genocide in Xinjiang. It's covering up its human rights abuses, and as I argue in my book, stymieing an independent scientific inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. And so that's what makes it authoritarian, that the goals and the interests with which China's economic statecraft is deployed are authoritarian and illiberal.
Well, I think that there's going to be a lot for people to learn when it comes to the how of what they do. And what you described strikes me as being a pretty good primer into how they do what they do. It shocks me sometimes that people have to discover that the C in Chinese Communist Party, there's the Chinese part, but there's the Communist part. And the Communist part is not a joke. It is very authoritarian. What you described as kind of the core thesis of this economic statecraft for geopolitical purposes just resonated with me as well. That's basically what they've always done for political purposes. So this is just an outgrowth of what they've done inside China from the launch of the Communist Party. And it's basically an expansion and exportation of some of the same tools where politics was first and the giving or taking away of opportunity, privilege, benefit was basically the nuts and bolts of how to control people, control a system. And if everyone just falls in line, then we can all do fine together. And so I think for a lot of the last half century, people assumed, well, China's just so backwards. We don't really, it's almost a joke to imagine that anyone's going to want their model or they're going to want to set the rules. But your book provocatively begins with Beijing Rules. So as you talk about this authoritarian economic statecraft model, what would be some of those Beijing rules that maybe like your top few of what Beijing is either implicitly proselytizing out into the world or explicitly proselytizing out into the world as an alternative to what you described as kind of the liberal world order I use in the lowercase broadest definition?
Sure. So the list of Beijing's rules has grown over time. But I'll list what we currently have. You're obviously not allowed to have a robust relationship with Taiwan. Preferably, you never even use the word Taiwan. If whether you're a company like an airline, a government, a person on Twitter, anybody. At most, you can say Taipei or Chinese Taipei, but you can never present Taiwan as being independent, as even having de facto independence. Or anything that remotely approaching that. Hong Kong, you're not allowed to present the reality on the ground in Hong Kong, that there is no such thing now as one country, two systems, that Beijing directly rules Hong Kong and has extended its authoritarianism there. And you certainly can't support the pro-democracy movement there. And the NBA, Daryl Morey, the manager of the Houston Rockets, learned this very dramatically in 2019, I believe it was, when he tweeted in support of the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests. And immediately, the Chinese market was totally shut off to the Rockets. And it's estimated that the loss of streaming revenue, loss of merchandise revenue, all kinds of revenue, cost the NBA at least $200 million. And there was pressure applied for him to be fired, and he was not. But what we haven't seen in the past 4 years is, really strong, outspoken NBA support for Hong Kong or any other human rights issue in China, with the exception of Inez Cantor, who is no longer with the NBA. So Xinjiang, of course, you're not allowed to talk about Xinjiang except to say, hasn't the Chinese Communist Party done a wonderful job there? Poverty alleviation, Uyghurs are so happy, yay. And as I mentioned earlier, what was a dramatic change in 2020. So let's say that you look at these things and you say, well, that's really unfortunate for people from Hong Kong. It's really unfortunate for Uyghurs and Taiwanese. But they're a pretty small percentage of the global population. this isn't something that the rest of us really have to worry about. Now, I've always disagreed with that. I've always been passionate about these issues, and they are certainly of import on their own right. But what we saw in 2020 was that more or less the Chinese government added free discussion of the origins of the coronavirus onto that list of core interests that you were not allowed to talk about. And that was, again, made very dramatically clear when then Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, in April 2020 made a call for at the UN for there to be an independent inquiry into the origins of the pandemic. And very soon after that, the Chinese government slapped tariffs on a whole range of Australian exports to China, which terrified people because Australia had previously been viewed as being very economically dependent on China. There's many examples of this, and I would say that another area now, expanding core interest that you're not allowed to talk about freely is the South China Sea. East China Sea, and Huawei, criticizing Huawei, saying that Huawei brings a security risk, and the sum of this, because the Chinese government has been incredibly consistent over the years, 25 years now, really, of using its economy to enforce this system of punishment and reward. And the result of that is that it has been incredibly successful, which is to say, every single CEO on the planet who has business interest in China knows that they cannot talk about these things freely. And increasingly, in fact, Beijing is requiring people to proactively support, so to actually not just not say things, but to proactively speak in favor, in support of China's interests. And I'll give a couple of examples. A few years ago, in 2020, after the Chinese government, after Beijing imposed through the Hong Kong government the draconian national security law in Hong Kong that wiped out its traditional political freedoms. I believe it was 54 countries that are all signed on to China's Belt and Road Initiative and benefit from China financially in that way, signed a letter and sent it to the UN Human Rights Commission saying that they approved of China's moves in Hong Kong and that everything was great and that Hong Kong's traditional system was being upheld. And so that's one example. And another, let's see if I can think of another. I had another example, but it's gone.
That's all right. That's all right. But it's very, very common. I mean, basically, they have always used the old friend of China as a tool, not necessarily to influence Chinese people or some of that, but basically the expectation was you're going to get privileged access and privileged treatment here. And in exchange, you sure will go and advocate for friendly, smooth relations between the U.S. and China. And it's basically been unregistered agents of Beijing coming back and talking. The idea was that they would talk to Congress, they would talk to the executive branch, they would talk in the media, they would talk in the entertainment industry, they would talk in churches and try to say that all is okay. What you're reading in the news and this commentary is exaggerated or just some small cases. And so they've had a deep practice in doing this. I think the main change now is that it's weaponized in much more open ways. It's using many more open tools, from social media to now wolf warrior diplomats that say these things out loud that they used to just say in private or expect others to say in private. It's now very, very open and aggressive. That's certainly very different than the U.S.-China relations I was initiated into in the 1980s and 90s. And it's, I think, just really rapidly accelerated. But I want to talk a little bit about how China engages, or the Communist Party more specifically engages in influence operations more broadly, and especially in our country. I mean, you did some work on this that opened the aperture on talking about what they're doing in our country and with whom. That field has also exploded in recent news cycles, and people's sort of blinders have been lifted to a degree of something that's been going on for a while, but now it's seen and talked about a bit more. And it's in a way, they're much more aggressively contending in our turf, not just when the Kissingers of the world go back to China and visit, or when these corporate CEOs gather for a forum over in China. They're engaging pretty aggressively here in a number of different ways. And so we think we might live in a nation where free speech is a value, but they are decidedly not a free speech actor. They have basically 70 plus years of practicing illiberal approaches to speech. And they seem to be pretty successfully curtailing speech about quote unquote sensitive topics, even here in the United States. What's been your observation on that front? I want, as we kind of wind down, we get that they've done these things and we're learning more about it. But it's probably news to a lot of Americans that the Communist Party of China actually has been pretty successful in trying to shape the way Americans talk to other Americans and what we even digest by way of content here in our own country.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll say that the first and last targets and victims of China's extraterritorial censorship are overseas Chinese communities, because what China fears.
An exclamation point on that. We try to emphasize that in every single episode. Something never ever to be forgotten. They're the first victim of the CCP.
That's right. And the reason for that is that what China fears more than anything else is an overseas pro-democracy movement that ends up seeping back into China and supplanting the power of the Chinese Communist Party. They're afraid of their own people, or even several generations later of their own people. And so in the Chinese language communities and Chinese communities in the U.S., it's been decades of various kinds of suppression. But there's I'm going to say an optimistic note here, which is that now the U.S. Department of Justice, the FBI, has an Office of Transnational Repression that has been investigating and pursuing many cases now of surveillance and harassment targeted and suppression targeted at Chinese communities in the United States. I've been issuing indictments and arresting people and putting people on trial for acting as agents of the Chinese state and suppressing and curtailing the democratic rights of people in Chinese communities here. And that is really, really good, because indictments make it public so that we know what's happening, and in a society in which we've seen a huge wave of anti-Asian racism and violence, I think that kind of messaging helps underscore to people that Chinese Americans are in many cases the vulnerable members of society, not the people to be feared. So a second point that I'll make is in terms of how China influences American society and narratives is through elite capture. And this targets, it certainly targets Chinese Americans, but I would say much more than that, and much more importantly than that, it targets anybody of any background, as long as they have power and money. And we've talked about a primary mechanism of this, which is access to China's economy and access to perks and access to prestige. And if you look, as far back as the 1990s, you have emphasized how long China's been doing this. President Clinton, when he was running for office, he ran on a platform of, quote unquote, butchers of Beijing, really tough China platform. And within 2 years of him taking office, he decided to delink trade and human rights so that the U.S. could have a more robust trade relationship with China. And we know now that he did that under the extensive lobbying of the U.S. business community, because they saw dollar signs. They wanted money. And in any Western capital or any capital city in the world, it is so often the business community that serves as a de facto pro-Beijing lobby. And you can see this so clearly in media interviews with people like Ray Dalio, and in Germany, the CEO of Volkswagen. You ask them about Xinjiang, and they're like, "What? I don't know anything about what's going on in Xinjiang. What? Volkswagen has a factory in Xinjiang. Of course they've read the headlines. Of course they know. But they're not allowed to talk about it or else it'll cost them money. And they know that. And so when you have this whole class of people who, and I talk about this in my book, when money gets involved in U.S. politics and when profits are, have a disproportionate role in our policies, and when those profits are there's gatekeeping involved from the Chinese Communist Party. This is, it's China's Communist Party, profits, U.S. politics and policy. And you can see that direct line of how Beijing has clear influence in that way. And so in my book, I talk about how can we push back against this? How can we fight, China's economic statecraft? And one key way to do it is to separate money from politics in the US. And that is an incredibly difficult thing to do right now in the US because we're so polarized. But if we could do that, if we could have campaign finance reform, if we could overturn Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that empowered super PACs, and if we could have fairer registration platforms at the state level in every state, these kinds of things would have a strong impact on how much the business community in the U.S. can influence U.S. politics in a pro-Beijing way.
Well, I certainly think there's a lot of work to be done to increase transparency about who is doing what with whom, and a lot that needs to be done to kind of out and shame people who basically get caught carrying the water for a government that is doing despicable things that are shown, whether it's the cables that you found or in many, many other verifiable ways. So, I mean, really, I think transparency in a key way would be the best deodorant in this.
I actually totally disagree with that.
Yeah.
Because transparency has not been functional. And in fact, what we're seeing in the world in general and in the US in particular is that when people have enough incentive to ignore naming and shaming, there's no mechanism to change their behavior. And for example, look at Elon Musk. We all know what's happening in Xinjiang, but he wants access to the EV market in China. And so he opened a showroom in Xinjiang in the middle of all those accusations of genocide, and no one could stop him. No one could stop him. I think that naming and shaming does not work in the long run. What works is laws. And I think we need to have more regulation about what businesses can do rather than expecting them to be, here's what we have. We have the richest, most powerful, authoritarian one-party state in the world versus individual businesses. Of course, those individual businesses are going to kowtow over and over again. It's not reasonable to expect them to do otherwise. What we have to do is, through regulations, put the power of the U.S. government behind those companies to make it a fair playing field.
Right. Well, systematically in America, the way the United States government stands legitimately on safe ground in doing so is when they have the explicit backing of the people who vote them into office.
Yes.
And it's in that area where I think that the discussion has to go. In recent years, we've had a conversation in the states and localities on China, CCP influences, and other issues that touch upon these broad policy topics. It's unlike anything in a couple of generations. It's the beginning, not the middle or the end, but it is the beginning of a different foundation for a different approach to China. And that's kind of what's at the core of the conversations that we try to have here, is to give people a lot of food for thought. Diagnosis is easy, prescription is hard, and the bridge between it is conversations like this to give people a lot to think about. So I want to give a chance for Bethany, you to share with people, for those who want to follow your research and commentary, where should they go to keep up to date on what's happening with your book, your research, and your commentary?
Sure. So you can follow me on Twitter at BethanyAllen-Ebrahimian, at Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian. And you can go to the Axios website and subscribe to my newsletter, Axios China. You can go to Amazon and search for Beijing Rules and buy my book there.
Excellent. Well, Bethany, I want to thank you for an in-depth, wide-ranging, and really fascinating conversation. I hope there's a lot of food for thought for our audience to draw upon for some time. For those of you in the audience, if you enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or on your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining us today, and a special thank you to Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian for sharing her perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.